Chapter 13. Hospital, Paul thought, but he didn't actually know where the nearest one was, and he didn't exactly relish the prospect of explaining how he'd come by 2 slashed wrists either. Ricky Wormtoad then. Paul had got the impression that Ricky knew a fair bit about treating wounds, reasonably enough. Besides, he had a certain amount to report, though he wasn't quite sure what to tell and what to leave out. But if anywhere was safe with Countess Judy prowling about, it'd be wherever Ricky was. After all, Ricky was a hero, a real one. He was so preoccupied with this train of thought that he turned a sharp corner without looking where he was going and collided with a life form. He couldn't see who he'd run into, but the sensation of his chin crunching on top of a head told him who his victim was. Mr. Tanner. Shit. Sorry. Paul couldn't talk properly with a jarred chin. Mr. Tanner took a step back to disentangle himself and scowled. His glasses were ever so slightly askew, which gave him a small boy, Just William look that would have had Paul in a fit of giggles in any other context. Idiot, Mr. Tanner said. Why can't you look with your... He tailed off, and Paul guessed that he'd caught sight of all the dried blood. Too late now to try hiding his hands behind his back. What the hell have you been up to? Mr. Tanner demanded. Paul's mind emptied like a department store during a bomb scare. Cut myself, he mumbled. Amazingly, I'd guessed that. What on? And if you tell me it's a paper cut, I'll turn you into a rat and let you loose in crufts. Paul thought quickly. It was just as pointless as thinking long and hard, but it wasted less time. Desk drawer, he said. There's a sort of jagged edge where the runner's a bit buckled, but it's okay, just a scratch. Mr. Tanner's eyes bored holes in him. Hint for you, he said. Never go into politics or the legal profession. You've got the stupidity, but your lying skills let you down every time. He grinned. If you don't want to tell me, that's fine. I was only concerned for your welfare. Protecting your investment, more like, Paul said, before he had a chance to stop himself. For some reason, Mr. Tanner was impressed, or amused, or both. He raised both eyebrows and didn't grin, but smiled. Very good, Mr. Tanner said. Did you figure it out for yourself, or did someone tell you? It wasn't hard to work out, Paul replied. I knew there had to be some reason why you wouldn't let us resign. Is that right? Very shrewd of you. Which reminds me, Mr. Tanner added, reverting to his default grin. Bauxite. We think we've got a sniff of some pretty decent deposits in Malawi, but we're having trouble pinning them down. Too many trees in the way or something. I'll send Christine up with some satellite pics. Try not to bleed on them if you can help it. For a moment, Paul wondered whether Mr. Tanner's newfound respect for him would be further increased if he told him where he could insert his bauxite. He weighed the evidence and decided against. All right, he said, but first I've got to see Mr. Wormtoad. What? Oh, I forgot. You were minding the store for him while he was away. Mr. Tanner shook his head. You know, the hero stuff's all very well, but I've got to look to the bottom line, and compared with minerals, the return on expense of time is pretty pathetic. Really, we're only in that sector as a service to our bigger clients. When the time comes for you to choose, I'd forget about it if I were you. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you have to. Mr. Tanner walked on, leaving Paul staring after him. Was it possible that Tanner didn't know what was going on, or was he just being his usual obnoxious self? Paul thought about it for a bit, and then decided it wasn't important, not compared with, say, whether he'd still be alive at the end of the week. Almost inevitably, Ricky Wormtoad wasn't in his office. Paul swore, then trudged down to reception, taking care to keep his hands in his pockets. Do you know where Mr. Wormtoad has got to? He asked a dazzling redhead behind the desk, only remembering at the last moment who she really was. Not a clue, Mr. Tanner's mum said, with a click of the tongue. Phone's been going for him all bloody day, she added, holding up a thick wad of while-you-were-out notes. What happened to you, by the way? Got yourself shaving, or is that ketchup from a leaky burger? Paul sighed. None of your business, he snapped. Then he remembered something else. While I'm here, he said, as casually as he could manage, you remember that cardboard box full of junk I got from my uncle a while back? You said you'd look after it for me. Her eyes widened slightly. Today they were emerald green and very round and deep. Vaguely, she said. What about it? I'd rather like it back, if that's all the same to you. Why? Her mouth tightened a little. I thought I told you. That stuff's nasty, not to be played with. Oh, I just wanted to look at it, Paul said. No big deal. I'll give it back as soon as I'm done with it, if it means that so much to you. Mr. Tanner's mum sniffed. "No need to get all snotty with me," she said. "It's for your own good, you ungrateful little toad. You haven't got a clue how to handle stuff like that, and I'm buggered if I'm rescuing you if you get yourself stuck in a probability mine or a Butterfield anomaly." "Oh," Paul thought. "That's not likely, is it?" She snickered. "That's serious kit you've got there," she said. "A bit advanced for you. It'd be like handing a chainsaw to a 10-year-old. "I'm not planning on using it," Paul said, and managed not to add, "honest. I just wanted to check something out, that's all." "Please yourself." She opened her mouth, inserted a finger, and hooked out what looked like a small lump of chewing gum. "Only don't blame me," she added as she laid it in the middle of her palm and blew on it gently. As it slowly began to grow, she put it down on the desk. 30 seconds later, it turned back into the cardboard box, albeit slightly moist and sticky with spit. "Thanks," Paul muttered, trying to find a dry bit to catch hold of. "Really, I appreciate you looking after it for me. I hope it didn't taste too bad?" Mr. Tanner's mum grinned. "Bit like chicken," she said. "Joke," she added. "Actually more like strawberries. Never could be doing with strawberries, mind. In fact, most fruit gives me heartburn. Natural carnivore, see?" Change of plan. Instead of continuing his search for Mr. Wormtorter, Paul decided to head back to his office with the box. When he got there, he found that the threatened aerial photographs had already arrived, mile upon mile of identical treetops in black and white, like an impressionist still life of a ball of wire wool. He put them carefully on one side so that the spitty box wouldn't mark them. Inside, just as he had left them, was Uncle Ernie's supernatural junk collection. The busted watch, the screwdriver, the library ticket, the pen and the box of chalks. "Burn them," he recalled Uncle Ernie saying. That was the chalks, wasn't it? He took them out and slid the lid open. They looked, felt and smelled like your basic schoolroom standard issue. How did you go about burning chalk, anyhow? He shook his head and stored them, along with the rest of the garbage, in his jacket pocket. In doing so, he found the little glassy stone. Funny, Paul thought. Didn't seem important anymore. He put it down on the desk for a moment while he dumped the cardboard box on the floor in the corner, where he wouldn't trip over it. When he turned back, he noticed that the stone was resting on top of the pile of photographs, and it was glowing faintly. Mildly curious, Paul picked it up. It felt very slightly warm, but the light inside it was fading rapidly. He put it back on the photo, but the light guttered and went out. Just for the hell of it, he moved it around on the glossy surface of the print, running it up and down systematically like a scanner. On the fourth pass it started glowing again, and Paul felt the familiar tingling sensation that meant he'd doused some bauxite. Automatically he got a marker pen from his drawer and drew a circle round the relevant spot. Then he took a long, considered look at the stone. After he'd been staring at it for a second or two, it seemed to change. Now it was like looking through a telescope. No, more like a zoom lens, because through it he could see the treetops getting closer until he could make out first branches, then twigs, then individual leaves. Now he was down below the canopy, zooming in on undergrowth, ferns, topsoil. Now he was under the ground, rushing past stones and roots until he came to a layer of clay, followed by a stratum of rock. That, apparently, was the end of the line, just rock. Paul sat up straight. Not just rock. Bauxite. Needless to say, he wouldn't know bauxite if he got it in a sandwich with onion rings and Branston pickle. Nevertheless, he recognised it, because the stone knew what it was, and knew it was what he was looking for. Something useful, Mr. Tanner's mum had said, and bauxite was useful stuff, surely, or else why did people bother digging it up out of the ground? Well, he thought, pretty cool trick, but actually I don't need the stone to do that. I've got this wonderful gift that means I can make lots of money for other people. He sat up and in doing so caught sight of the stack of mouldy old photo albums he'd dumped in his bookshelf, the ones that had been in Uncle Ernie's box, along with all the toys. I wonder, Paul thought. Well, no harm in trying. He took down an album at random and opened it at the beginning. Now he thought about it, he realised that he hadn't actually looked in any of the albums himself. Mr. Tanner's mum had looked for him to see if they were dangerous or booby-trapped. She'd said they were safe, just a lot of snapshots of ugly people, presumably his relatives. That had been enough to put Paul off looking for himself. Nearly all the worst hours of his pre-J.W. life had been Sunday afternoons, spent at the house of some horrendous elderly female relation with photo albums. You only had to see one, with its patterned cover and distinctive shiny pages to tune out automatically. Sort of reverse catnip. It had never occurred to him that there might be anything in them worth spending time on, but he'd have said the same about a screwdriver or a broken watch. Screwing the stone into his right eye like a jeweller's loop, Paul examined the first photo. With both eyes open, he saw a group of glum-looking people gathered around a small plastic Christmas tree. If their appearance was anything to go by, Paul didn't understand about women's fashions, but he could recognise men's flared trousers, fat ties, wide lapels and monster sideburns as the mark of the beast. The picture was 30-odd years old. He didn't recognise any of the faces. When Paul shut his left eye, however, something very strange happened. It was a variation on the zoom lens effect he'd encountered when he looked at the bauxite photo. He was swooping down from a great height towards a small table in the corner of the room, well away from the tree and the mob scene. Just when the vertigo was about to knock him silly, his point of view screeched to a jarring stop, and he realised he was looking at a scrap of paper lying on the tabletop. Now his viewpoint was closing in very slowly, and he could make out handwriting on the paper. A little further in, and he could read what it said. "Hello." Well, that seemed friendly enough. It was just a scrap of paper in a photograph. Maybe a note to say, "Gone out, your dinner's in the oven," or, bearing in mind the context, a child's thank you letter. Paul read on. "I'm afraid I don't know your name, mostly because you haven't been born yet. I don't even know if you're my great-nephew or my great-niece. In fact, it's possible you may be neither, in which case, Judy, it's a pity no one ever told you it's rude to read other people's letters. But assuming that Donnie and Lynn, that's them on the extreme right of the group, get married and have you, welcome to the family. Now, I doubt very much whether your parents will have told you about your pedigree. They don't know yet themselves, and I'm in two minds about whether to tell them or not. My nephew Donnie has many sterling qualities, I guess. For one thing, he's mostly waterproof, and his fingernails grow pretty well, and he plays an adequate game of canasta. But he's also loud, arrogant, stupid, bad-tempered, and so far up himself he's in danger of coming out of his own ear. I don't know Lynn all that well yet, but I have my suspicions she's mostly a waste of valuable resources, and the best that can be said of her is that she can use a knife and fork without putting anybody's eye out. But there it is. You can't choose your parents. I chose them for you, see below. And maybe you'll turn out all right in the end. Brave, clever, resourceful, caring and dedicated, like me. Stranger things have happened. Anyway, here we go. Our lot, the Carpenters, have had inherent supernatural abilities for at least 30 generations. 1,000 years, give or take, and probably longer. I'm the only really outstanding supernatural practitioner we've produced, but over the years we've churned out competent sorcerers and magicians every other generation, and the trend would actually seem to be towards our abilities getting stronger as time goes on. Just think, if that's true, you could turn out to be even better at this shit than I am. Well, Paul thought, I'll say this for him. He's got the knack of fitting a long letter on a small bit of paper. That aside, though, I think I'll reserve judgment. Allow me to introduce myself, by the way. My full name, rank and serial number is something like Professor Ernest James Carpenter, MT, FRCMS, ZWG, Stuttgart, CSMI, Bladi, as well as being visiting Professor of Effective Magic at Cambridge and Reader in Glamour and Enchantment at the University of Chicopee Falls, Idaho. I'm a senior consultant with J.W.Wells Co of 70 St Mary Axe, London. In practical terms, that means that if I want to, I can make you think that a raddled old boiler looks like Elizabeth Taylor and that you're a traffic cone. Hot stuff, obviously. Your mother's family, assuming she becomes your mother in the fullness of time, comes from a long, though frequently pruned, line of heroes, claiming descent from Beowulf on one side and Brian Boru on the other. How heroes come to have a long line beats me, since what they're best at is dying young. However, it has to be said that what they're second best at is breeding like rabbits. Anyhow, your mum is the outcome of a millennium and a half of peerless swordspersons, brave dragon slayers, champions of the oppressed and similar pests. This means, I sincerely hope, that you will grow up to be both a hero and a magician, brave and clever, though there's excellent grounds for saying the two qualities are mutually exclusive, but what the hell. My intention is for you to join J.W.W at an early age, zoom up the corporate ladder like a ferret up a conduit, get made a partner before you're 30, and be fully trained, armed and prepared when the moment comes when I'm either dead, incommunicado, or too senile to blow my own nose, and someone has to take my place as leader of the human side in the secret war between us and those incomparable bastards, the Fae. I hope you won't mind too much that I've condemned you to a life of danger, struggle, and extreme weirdness without giving you the faintest vestige of a choice. I'm doing it for the best, needless to say. After all, the human race has got to be saved, and if I've been lumbered with the chore, I don't see why I shouldn't make someone else share the misery with me. Of course, you may well not see it like that if you can take after your mother's side. Did I mention that the heroic mentality has always been a complete and utter mystery to me? Anyway, to practicalities. Obviously, I can't predict how the war will go for the next 30 years or so, which means I can't offer you much in the way of concrete, useful advice. By now, you should have worked out that Judy di Castelbianco is a truly nasty piece of work, and you shouldn't trust her any further than you can sneeze her through a blocked nostril. Likewise, that the only way you'll ever win this war is to get rid of her once and for all. How you're supposed to go about this, I have no idea. She can't be physically killed, tried that, no dice, or locked up or mutilated to the point of effective disability. Trying to destroy her mind and reduce her to the level of a gibbering loon is like trying to drown a fish in water. The only possibility I can think of is to find and eliminate her source. As you probably know, each individual Fae is no more or less than a dream, dreamed by a sleeping human. If you find the dreamer, the source we call them, and wake him or her up, the dream stops and the Fae gets whizzed back to his own side of the line. Mostly, that's not much help. Next time the source goes to sleep, the Fae comes back. But the relatively few specimens who've managed to establish themselves permanently on our side of the line, Judy for instance, need to be dreamt continuously, without interruption. If their sources wake up even once, they're banished for good. That sounds encouraging, but understandably enough, the Fae go to enormous lengths to safeguard the sources of their permanent colonists. They keep them constantly sedated, in a place so secure that no human has ever found it. Even if you were to discover it, I don't imagine you could simply shin up a drain pipe and jemmy open the bathroom window. Fort Knox is most likely a bus shelter in comparison. But there you go. Nobody said life was supposed to be easy or fair or even a guaranteed minimum length. I wish you the very best of luck at any rate. By the way, if you're nurturing any romantic notions of having nothing to do with any of this, going as far away as you can get and earning a modest but honest living mending typewriters in Bhutan, forget it. For one thing, I intend to fix it so you can't. For another, even if you succeeded, Judy would almost certainly hunt you down and slaughter you like a Christmas turkey simply because you're related to me. At least if you hold still and do as you're told, she's less likely to kill you on sight and more likely to try and subvert you into being useful to her, which would probably add maybe as much as 5 years to your life expectancy. Happy hunting! Your affectionate great-uncle-to-be, Ernest Carpenter. Wouldn't it be wonderful, Paul thought, wouldn't it be absolutely fucking grand if life somehow contrived to let 5 minutes go by without dumping some new and incrementally horrible load of shit on my head from a great height. He snapped the album shut, then, on a sort of guilty whim, opened it again at random. In the corner of the first snap that caught his eye, a moody study of a small fat child eating an ice cream on a park bench, he saw a crumpled up newspaper poking out of a litter bin. At once the Zoom business started up, and a moment or so later he was reading an article on Sports Page which said, P.S. In case I forgot to remind you before I die, or you read this, don't play with the watch and remember to burn the chalks. Regards, EJC. Paul sighed. All right already, he'd burn the stupid chalks. Only how would you go about doing a thing like that? Soak them in petrol, blow a torch? Or would putting them under the grill and pretending they were sausages get the job done just as effectively? Of course, if he still had his portable door, he could simply take a sideways journey to the slopes of Etna or Mount Washington and pitch them over the edge. But he'd lent the wretched thing to Ricky Wormtorder, who'd lost it to the Fae. Suddenly he remembered the times he'd fallen asleep while wading through the incredibly loathsome Mortensen printouts at Countess Judy's command. How each time he'd nodded off he'd dreamed about a portal in the wall through which platoons of evil kiddies had crept into the world. It all made perfect sense. Judy had the door, and she'd given him the most boring job in the whole world so that he'd fall asleep right here in the office and dream across her advance guard of hand-picked stormtroopers. All at once, a sort of cold, brittle fury filled Paul. It wasn't so much the disgusting parasitic way she'd used him, like a fly laying its eggs in an open wound. It wasn't even the manipulation or the chilling thought of all those hundreds of maliciously grinning children now safely across the line and poised to begin the task of wiping out the human race. No, what really ticked him off was that he'd been forced to sort and collate thousands and thousands and thousands of revolting Mortensen printouts all through the weekend in what should have been his free time, simply as camouflage, a diversion, a ruse. If ever there was a case of a tablespoon of insult with every teaspoon of injury, this had to be it. Right, he thought. Fine. If I was born into this stupid bloody war, so be it. But the hell with Uncle Ernie and saving the world and someone having to do the dirty, rotten job. I'm going to make Countess Judy pay through the nose and all other relevant orifices for making me do all that work for nothing. Silently he swore a solemn and dreadful oath to himself that he'd get her for that, if, as seemed entirely possible, it was the last thing he did. So, what had he got? Go off to the source, Uncle Ernie had said, find out who's dreaming Countess Judy and her fellow infiltrators and where they were being stashed, then wake them up. Simple as that. Paul pocketed the stone before he lost it, in the process finding the stub end of a roll of polo mints that he hadn't remembered being there before. But it's well known that stubs of polo rolls breed in warm, dark, linty places. He stood up and threw the photo albums back on the shelf. Oh, he thought, for a portable door right now. All he'd have to do would be to slap it on the wall, tell it to take him whatever Judy saw of livestock, and that'd be that. But he didn't have the door anymore, thanks to Ricky bloody Wormtorter. Ricky. A nasty thought stuck in Paul's mind like a fishbone. Hadn't Uncle Ernie said something about a traitor inside J.W. itself? At the time he hadn't thought about it. He'd vaguely assumed that he'd meant Countess Judy, but that didn't make sense. A traitor was a hidden enemy, not someone who paraded up and down in the corridors wearing a fluorescent sweatshirt with "enemy" written on both sides. But Ricky had borrowed Paul's portable door, the secret weapon that would make it possible for Judy to bring across her stormtroopers by the 100, not one by one over a long period as she'd been doing previously. If Ricky was... There was a kind of grisly logic to it. As far as Paul knew, the door had somehow been lost or hidden until he'd stumbled across it 3 months or so back. Maybe Uncle Ernie or someone like that had deliberately hidden it away. That's right, hidden it under the predestined saviour of mankind, me. Fuck it. Turned up to claim it. As soon as that happens, the traitor nips in and makes some excuse to get his paws on it, and then vanishes. That would explain a lot of things. Why Ricky hadn't been in the cell with Paul and Monica. Why he'd been put in Ricky's department, apprenticed to him. Why Ricky had always been so nice to him, bought him lunch on his first day and everything. Ricky was a traitor, and all that stuff about pretending to help Paul and save him that night when Ricky had burst through the window, that was just play acting, intended to trick Paul into trusting him. The bastard! Never should have trusted a man with wavy blonde hair in the first place. They're all scum, those wavy blondes. Right, you'd see about that. If Ricky was the traitor, did that mean he still had the door? Unlikely. Judy would have taken possession of it for herself. No matter, he had the rest of Uncle Ernie's magic set, objects so powerful they'd made Mr. Tanner's mum turn pale. True, what Paul really wanted right now was some kind of very powerful but simple and easy-to-use weapon, and none of Ernie's bits and bobs really seemed to fit that description. Well, maybe the Sea Scout badge, but he'd contrived to lose that right at the start. But he had the rest of the stuff. Screwdriver, watch, chalks, memo to self, must burn chalks, but how? As far as weapons went, he could pick up a tire lever or length of lead pipe along the way. Simplicity was the way to go where the fundamentals were concerned. He was, God help him, a hero, whether he liked it or not. He'd been born and trained to it, and, in the opinion of J.W.W., he'd passed his indentures and qualified. Fine. If they wanted a hero, they'd just got one, and the best possible sort, a thoroughly bad-tempered, pissed-off, grudge-laden hero. Their lookout. Paul patted the jacket pocket containing the watch, the chalks, and the screwdriver, ate a slightly dilapidated polo meant for luck, and reached for the door handle. On the point of leaving the room, he stopped, dithered, then pulled down the photo album he'd just been looking at. It fell open at the picture of the fat kid with the ice cream. He looked at it again, both with and without the Wyvern stone. There had been something about it, but he couldn't quite figure out what. It was a pretty bad picture. A bit dark, slightly blurred. The kid looked fatally constipated, with a strained expression and bulging eyes turned red by the glare of the flash. And the photographer, an adherent of the Boudica school of composition, had cut him off at the ankles. Paul wondered who the brat was, and at once the Wyvern stone provided him with handy subtitles. Derek Carpenter, aged 10, Richmond Park. He ransacked his memories of endless dreary tea times with visitors and dredged up an Uncle Derek who wasn't really an uncle at all, just some species of cousin. He considered the data and concluded that whatever the big deal was, he hadn't figured it out yet. The hell with it. He threw the album back on the shelf and went to war. All very well saying that, but as Paul emerged into the corridor, he was painfully aware that he had no idea what to do next. His only fragment of a plan of campaign was to find the Fae dormitory and wake up the dreamers. But that was like putting bring about world peace on the top of his things-to-do list, fixed by a small magnet to the fridge door. Fine in principle, but a tad vague as far as the practical aspects were concerned. All right, step 1, burn the chalks. Even that was something of an ask, slap bang in the middle of the city of London, not exactly known for its plethora of unguarded open fires. Finally, with great reluctance, he decided that if anybody might know where a fire was, it would be Mr. Tanner's mum. He set his course for reception. Fire? Mr. Tanner's mum repeated, frowning. What do you want a fire for? To burn something, Paul replied. No kidding. Mr. Tanner's mum narrowed her eyes. Well, there's a couple of what's-its, Bunsen burners in the lab. They might do the trick, depending on what you want to torch. Paul looked at her. There's a lab in the building. They call it that, replied Mr. Tanner's mum, but really it's just a converted bathroom, up on the 3rd floor. It's where Theo Van Spee and a few of the others go to play about with chemicals when they're brewing a love filter and stuff like that. They used to have one of those really big propane furnaces, she remembered, so they could melt down rings of power without having to leave the office, but they had to throw it out. Fire regulations or something. The Bunsen burners sound like they'll do just fine, Paul told her. Where on the 3rd floor did you say it was? He found it eventually. It looked more like a kitchen than a laboratory. Worktop along 2 walls, a 3rd lined with what looked like MFI's most basic range of pine effect melamine cupboards, a fridge and a stainless steel sink. But there was no cooker, and 2 Bunsens sat in the corner next to the sink, partly hidden behind a stack of Perspex dishes, with a dog-eared box of Swan Vestas perched on top. There was also a bolt on the inside of the door, which pleased him. Privacy, he felt, was likely of the essence. In the event, the chalks burned quite easily once Paul had fiddled with the collars to get the Bunsens up to a maximum heat. He had a feeling that real chalk didn't flare up like that, suggesting that Uncle Ernie had modified them somehow to serve a more demanding role than writing on blackboards or keeping score in darts tournaments. Once the last one had resolved itself into smoke and residue, however, he was back where he'd been just a short while ago, planless, clueless, and alone. For want of anything better to do, he perched on a lab stool and turned the empty chalk packet over in his hands. Go find Countess Judy's sauce. Easy peasy. Well, it had to be somewhere, didn't it? Unfortunately, the world is made up of billions of contiguous somewheres, and any single one of them could be anywhere at all. Indeed, given the tricky nature of the Fae, it could be just as easily in Montana or Burkina Faso in England, which would make getting there as much of a challenge as finding it, unless, of course, he had a portable door, or something very similar. Yeah, right, Paul told himself, in your dreams. When he was a kid, there used to be a poster with a picture of some suntanned females sitting on a golden beach and a caption, "In your dreams you've been to Tunisia." Weird thing to remember after all these years, but the point was a valid one. In a dream, you can go anywhere. Unfortunately, as a mode of transport, dreams share one regrettable common feature with Ryanair and South West trains. You have no control over where you're likely to end up or what state you'll be in when you get there. Hitherto, Paul had always assumed that was because dreams are just mental indigestion, stray thoughts from the waking day glopping up into the unconscious mind like gas in a swamp. Now, of course, he knew better. If he had a dream about Blackpool, it was because some freeloading fae wanted to go there. Trying to use dreams to get to where he wanted to go was about as likely to work as disguising yourself as an airliner and sitting on a runway, hoping someone would come along and fly you to your chosen destination. Unless... well, it was worth a try, given that he had no alternative whatsoever, and if it went wrong, the worst that could happen... no, bad line of argument. The worst that could happen would be dying in his sleep, harvested by Countess Judy and her terrifying associates. Better to dwell on the no alternative whatsoever aspect, with a healthy wodge of semi-hysterical prayer to fall back on as a contingency plan. Paul sat down in the corner of the room, head resting against a cupboard door, and tried to picture her as she'd been. That time he'd seen her. It was hard. Her face slipped through the meshes of his mind like whitebait in a cod fishing net, morphing into other faces, more immediate but less helpful. Finally, once he'd got what he reckoned was the best fix he was likely to get, he opened the cupboard door next to him and looked inside for something suitable. In the end, he had to settle for a big, chunky, old-fashioned brass microscope. Rather heavier than he'd have liked, but the only artefact he'd come across that looked capable of doing the job. He took a sheet of plain white copier paper from a pile by the sink and laid it on the worktop, with one edge projecting slightly. Then he put the microscope on the paper and sat down on the floor directly underneath. "Here goes nothing," Paul said to himself, and tugged the paper as hard as he could. The paper slid out, jarring the microscope over. It toppled and dropped off the worktop directly onto Paul's head. "Yeah, oosh," he remembered thinking, just for a split second, and then he was sprawled on the floor, bleeding freely from a long but superficial scalp wound, fast asleep. Once he knew he was asleep, he looked around frantically. "Hello," he called wordlessly. "Are you there?" A very long and distressing pause, and then, quite suddenly, there she was. As before, pale golden light glowed all around her, fuzzy and hazy as the fur on furry pink slippers. Where her short flaxen hair ended and the pale glow began was hard to say, but the way it reflected off her golden skin was really quite... Paul pulled himself together. No time for any of that stuff now. "You're strange," said the girl of his dreams. "Did you summon me here to watch you knock yourself out with obsolescent scientific equipment?" "You're her, aren't you? My dream girl." "You say the sweetest things." "Yes, but you're her, aren't you? The one that came to talk to me a week or so back. You told me to buck my ideas up and get involved in stuff." She nodded. "You were wearing red paisley pyjamas," she said, with a very faint grin. "You're her," Paul said, with a sigh of relief. "Right. Please listen carefully, because we need to get this right." "We? Am I a part of this? What are we doing then? Will it be like the time when you had 3 glasses of red wine on an empty stomach, and you had this dream where we were on the tiger skin rug on the beach at Mystique?" "No," Paul said with a faint quaver in his voice, and he was thinking some dreams I wish I could remember when I wake up. "Look, you're a fae, right? A good fae." She frowned. "Depends on what you mean by good. If you mean it like the phrase, a good Catholic, then no, probably not." Paul shook his head. Just as well it was only a dream, since his real head would have hurt like hell. "There are 2 sides in the Civil War thing, yes? Good fate and bad." "Ah," she smiled. "You mean good as a synonym for on the losing side?" "Yes," she added before he could interrupt. "I'm a fae and I'm on our side." "What of it?" Paul breathed out. "In that case," he said, "could you possibly give me a lift somewhere?" She frowned. "It depends. Where?" "I don't know." Not the best answer. What I meant to say was, there's somewhere I need to go, but I don't know how to find it or how to get there. I'm not even sure it's possible to get in there if you're awake. Can you help me? Her frown turned itself inside out and became a smile. "You're out of your tiny mind. You know that. Do you seriously want to go back to Countess Judy's castle?" "Of course I don't want to," Paul growled, "but I think it may be the only option. I need to find out where she stores her sauce. You know, the poor bastard who's dreaming her." "Find him. Right. Then what?" "Then," Paul muttered, "wake him up." The girl of his dreams let out a low whistle. "What's come over you all of a sudden?" she asked curiously. "All the time I've known you, you've been this timid little wimp. Now you're talking about storming the enemy stronghold and killing the Queen. Have you been on one of those self-assertiveness weekends or something?" Paul shook his head. It's her or me," he said. "She's going to kill me if I don't get her first. Look, if I get through this ghastly mess in one piece, I promise I'll go back to being a spineless piece of cheese, if that's what you want." No, not at all. Besides, it probably didn't occur to you, but if you get the snuff, I die too. Helping you would probably be a good move for me at this point." "Fine," Paul said. "Great. Can you do it? Get me there, "Oh, I can get you there," she replied. "That's easy. Keeping you alive for more than 2 seconds once we've got there is going to be the challenging part, particularly now you're so brave and resolute and all. There's no half measures with you, are there? Straight from not saying boo to geese to strangling lions with your bare hands." Paul looked at her steadily in the eye. "Please," he said. "All right. Just this once. It's entirely against my better judgment, and it'll all end in tears, but why the hell not?" She raised her right arm in a graceful, dramatic sweep, then paused. "Just one thing," she said. "You do realise, don't you, that when we're over there, your physical body'll still be here?" Paul shrugged. "I hadn't actually," he said. "Will that make much of a difference?" "Think about it," she replied, not unkindly. "For a start, supposing you find this source, how are you planning on waking him up?" "Oh," Paul said. "That's all?" "Oh." "All right. Oh dear, it's not going to work then. Sorry to have bothered you. Is that any better?" "There's no need to get all snotty with me," she said. "I'm not the one who never thinks things through. What you need," she went on, ever so slightly patronising, "is a dream telescope." "Oh, what?" Paul was about to ask, but he was interrupted by a sharp blow to his groin. He yelled. "Baby," said the girl of his dreams mockingly. "Well, go on, look at it." The cause of his profound discomfort proved to be a long brass tube with bits of glass in each end. "For looking at the stars," she explained. "When we get there, look for the Great Bear. Third from the right. Usually works." Paul knew that he had that bewildered half-to-death expression on his face, but he couldn't help it. "Excuse me?" he said. "Idiot," she said. "When you wish upon a star, your dreams come true, right? To a certain extent, anyway. And please be careful with that thing. It's old and fragile, and I had to sign for it when I checked it out of the stores. I take it you know how to find the Great Bear?" I think so." "He thinks so. Fine. Just crane your neck back as far as it'll go and search for something that looks like L.S. Lowry's idea of a rotary cultivator." "Third from the right." "And straight on till morning. Sorry, forget I said that. It'll only confuse the issue. Ready?" "I've had a better idea," Paul said as she raised her arm again. "How would it be if you drew me a map of how to get there and I just—" The light that surrounded her flared out and smothered him. At the same moment he fell upwards, like a suddenly weightless Australian. The world exploded and then closed around his head like a plastic bag. "Got the bus or something?" Paul wobbled, waved his arms for balance and steadied himself. He was in total darkness, apparently alone. The telescope was still in his left hand. "Crane your neck back," she'd said, "as far as it'll go." He did that, and then slowly lifted the telescope to his eye. Through it, he could see a sprinkling of white dots, like dandruff on God's collar. To begin with, they were just a random scattering, but he concentrated until the shape of the Great Bear emerged from the jumble. He counted 3 from the right. "Wish," he said, "wish, wish, wish." Something hit Paul so hard in the small of the back that he fell over onto his knees. It was only when the lights abruptly snapped on that he realised it was his own body, catching him up and embracing him like a large friendly dog. The disturbing thing was, he recognised the place. He'd been there before, in dreams. Mostly it looked like a hospital ward, a huge one, with lines of beds stretching away out of sight in all directions, each bed with a chart and a name tag clipped to the end rail, and someone asleep between the cold, crisp white sheets. But it put him in mind of other things too, a morgue, a battery chicken farm, and also the stockroom at the back of a shoe shop. There was something industrial about the sparse cleanliness, the silence, the order. Somebody used this place to store valuable stock in trade and wasn't making any false economies when it came to upkeep. At least he hadn't triggered any alarms, or any that he could hear. But what would the Fae need with electronics anyhow? It was inevitable that they were monitoring Paul, and surely they'd be here any minute to whisk him off to the dungeons of Grendel's Aunt. The real ones this time, not the prettified imitation he'd found himself in before. Maybe, if he was really lucky, he might have 30 seconds in which to identify and find Judy de Castelbianco's dreamer and wake him up. He glanced up and down the rows. He'd never been much good at quantity surveying. His mental counter only went up to 6, and anything over that was just lots. At a guess, though, there was somewhere between 30,000 and 1,000,000,000 of the poor bastards. Even if they had the names of the parasites they were playing host to printed neatly on their clipboards, 30 seconds wasn't really long enough, was it? Idiot. Yes, well, while he was here, he might as well do something. If he could wake just one of them up, that would be a fair colonist switched off at the mains forever. Paul doubted whether it would do the walk and source any good, but you can't have every damn thing in this imperfect world. All right then. One sleeper chosen at random out of all of these. Most of them, Paul noted idly, were women. Young women mostly, which made sense, since presumably the main quality you'd be looking for in your source would be durability. Women live longer than men, and the younger you catch them, the longer they're likely to last. If he'd been there doing scientific research, he might have speculated as to whether a male human could only dream a male fae, or whether it didn't matter a damn. As it was, he resolved a decision-making problem by closing his eyes and pointing. The specimen he discovered he'd chosen was a thin little wisp of a thing, dark, wiry hair, a pointed face, thin lips that moved as she breathed, just as Sophie's did. In fact, the resemblance was striking, except that Sophie, though as thin as a politician's excuse, wasn't that scrawny. Rather, she looked as Sophie might have done if she hadn't eaten for a week. Christ! Paul thought. For quite a while he couldn't move at all, even though every heartbeat that rocked his body reminded him of the passing of that painfully finite resource, time. When he unfroze, he came close and peered down at the girl. Definitely, but so starved and drawn it made him ill to look at her. Then he noticed the IV drip plastered to her arm, just enough to keep her alive, presumably, but too weak to wake up. Thorough, the Fae, and quite methodical. "Sophie!" His voice echoed disastrously, like a fart in a cathedral. "Sophie, it's me. For God's sake, wake up. Please. Now." A tiny little grunt, like the sound of a far distant pig, and then she stirred slightly and rolled over. She was lying on her left arm. She often did that, and then woke up with pins and needles and a really bad temper for the rest of the day. Sowing the seeds of carpal tunnel syndrome too. After all, what would be the point of rescuing her from this place, this fate that might even be genuinely worse than death, if she ended up with permanent cramp in her little finger? "Sophie!" he repeated, trying to make his voice loud, but it wouldn't cooperate. Every inherent instinct was against it. "Paul, keep quiet. Paul, don't you dare make a sound or I'll take you straight home again. Please," he added, just in case she was ignoring him, because he was being bossy and overbearing. "Fucking hell, Sophie, what have they done to you? Please wake up, they'll be here any minute, I haven't got time." And then it occurred to Paul to wonder, whose source was she anyway? Who was in her dreams right now, drawing off her lifelike beer from the wood? Not that it mattered, but... "Mr. Carpenter." The voice made Paul spin round, almost losing his balance as his feet lost traction on the hard tiled floor. "Please step away from the bed immediately." "You!" was all he could find to say, even though it was scarcely original, not to mention a disrespectful mode of address to use to a partner, to her face. "You did this to her!" Countess Judy nodded, her face grave and still. "Miss Pettingale was assigned to my department," she said. "Also, she is, like yourself, the property of the firm. She's my personal assistant, and that," she added severely, "is none of your concern. Please, step away from the bed." She's dreaming you. She's your source." "Correct." Countess Judy took a step forward and, just for a moment, looked down at the sleeping girl. "She looks so fragile, doesn't she? Waif-like, vulnerable, almost beautiful in a vague, pre-Raphaelite way. Pity she has such a vile temper." "There you go," Paul said grimly. "Sweet and sour sauce. Ha ha." Perhaps he shouldn't have said that. "If you don't step away this instant," Judy growled, "I shall have no alternative but to call security and have you restrained." "But why?" Stupid question. "I mean, what did you need her for? You must have had a dreamer already, or how could you have been here before we joined?" Countess Judy clicked her tongue, a suffering fool's gladly sort of noise. "My previous source died," she said in a bored voice. "She was 106 after all. Most fortunately, her last illness was diagnosed early, so I had enough time to find a replacement. Miss Pettingill should ensure me at least 80 more years before I have to go through that particular chore again. I will give you one last chance, Mr. Carpenter. Otherwise—" But Paul shook his head. "You don't dare," he said. "If you could touch me, you'd have done it already, but you can't. You're scared she'll wake up. That's right, isn't it?" "Absurd," Countess Judy replied, but her voice had risen in a semitone or so. "I am simply trying to spare you the consequences of your stupidity. You can't possibly understand the issues involved, and even if you did succeed in waking Miss Pettingill up, the consequences for you would be most regrettable." She shook her head as though in disappointment. "I can see it hasn't even crossed your mind that she wouldn't want to be woken up. For a human, the sheer joy of dreaming one of us is, well, quite beyond the power of your language to describe. You would destroy her, Mr. Carpenter, and yourself as well." "Balls," Paul said. "You're the one who's going to die when she wakes up." Without breaking eye contact, he groped down at the bed until he connected with something. Sophie's nose, by the feel of it. He closed his fingers and squeezed hard, then let go a little. "She breathes through her nose when she's asleep," he said, and if there was no more than a 50-50 chance that he was right about that, since he hadn't actually noticed, he was betting Judy didn't know that. "If I do this, she'll wake up." "Actually," Judy said with a slight yawn, "she'll suffocate. Is that what you want? Are you prepared to kill her in order to injure me?" "Yes." Liar, pants on fire. But could she see that in his face or hear it in his voice? "I'm a hero, remember? You had your trade to train me, remember? That's the sort of thing that heroes do, and then they spend the rest of the series beating themselves up over it. But by then it's too late." "My traitor," Julie smiled wryly. "What a talent you have for melodrama, Mr. Carpenter. What you obviously consider betrayal was merely his job, nothing more. After all, we all work for the same firm, don't we? In order to carry out my duties and bring in a very substantial fee income, I do need to be alive. The rest of the partners authorize this, of course. I would never do anything without the knowledge and approval of my colleagues." "Like it mattered," Paul said. "Mr. Carpenter," her eyes were as cold as winter, "I have refrained up until now from calling security, because if I do, they will take you, shred your mind, and then kill you. Since you two are the firm's property, representing a not insignificant financial outlay, I would prefer to resolve this matter another way. However, I must insist that you do as you are told immediately. Otherwise, I will not be responsible for the consequences." "Piss off," Paul tried to say, but it came out as He shuffled closer to the bed, grabbed Sophie's shoulder and started shaking it as hard as he could. She flopped about, alarmingly easy to move. The drip feed came out of her arm, and that panicked him even more, but she didn't wake up. "It's pointless," Countess Judy said. "She won't wake up, not without the right medication. And if you carry on like that, you'll do her an injury. I'm sorry," she added, "but I did warn you." Whether they came out of the shadows or whether they had been there all the time, Paul couldn't tell, but there were ever so many of them, silvery grey like snow clouds, hard to see and harder to keep an eye on as they merged into the grey walls, but their faces were hard and smooth and their eyes were cold, like those of deep frozen children, and it seemed like a fair bet that they weren't crowding in on him to shake his hand or teach him card tricks. He dug his nails into Sophie's shoulder, begged her, "Sophie, please wake up." But her head lay flopped on the pillow, and the only sound she made was a very faint snore. The closest of the grey shadows was almost within arm's reach now. As he reached out, the sleeve of his robe fell away from his hand, revealing a set of broad, bitten fingernails. Odd, Paul couldn't help thinking, in a small backwater of his mind that even then had nothing better to occupy its time with. Bitten fingernails. But why would a dream bite its nails? Which claws disconcertingly around his earlobe and twisted it. Paul yowled with pain and shrank back, at which the grey shape wobbled and suddenly appeared to break in two at the waist. The upper half toppled forward, let go of Paul's ear, crashed to the ground, slipping out from under the robe in the process.
"Idiot," it said. "Clown," it added, as the stilts it had been standing on clattered to the floor. "Benny!" shrieked Countess Judy in sheer fury. "What the hell do you think you're playing at?"